Good evening. The British Council Library is privileged to host Dr. Sujit Sivasundaram, Professor of World History at Gonville and Caius College, University of Cambridge. He is also the director of the university's Center of South Asian Studies. His work is in world history, especially of the 18th and 19th centuries. He has served as a visiting professor at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Paris, and as a visiting senior research fellow at both the Asia Research Institute of the National University of Singapore and the University of Sydney. He was the Saclay-Caillaud Fellow 2015-2017 at the National Maritime Museum, Greenwich, and in 2012 was awarded a Philip Lieberhielm Prize for History. He regularly speaks to public audiences and school audiences and has spoken at the Hay Festival, the Jaipur Literary Festival, and the Cheltenham Festival. He gave the Royal Historical Society's Prothero Lecture in 2019 and the University of Edinburgh's Fennell Lecture in 2018. This evening, he will be drawing especially from his work, Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire, published by William Collins, as he talks to the British Council Library. In Waves Across the South, Professor Sivasundaram eloquently escorts his reader on the waves of history which ebbed and flowed in the Persian Gulf, down the Bay of Bengal and southern India, across Singapore and Indonesia, via Tonga and New Zealand, and finally to Tasmania. He brings to life, often with very relatable anecdotes of people of those times, the age of revolutions, and the tides of change it caused to wash over an entire hemisphere. In his own words, he has said, "The physical setting of this story matters. At a time when the world was expanding, the sea was both a barrier and a carrier, and the coast was the site of first contact between indigenous and foreign, between trader and trader, between new and old ideas. To think with waves is to think with the push and pull dynamic of globalization." Sujit, welcome to the British Council Library, and thank you from us all to you for finding the time on your break back home to talk to us. And I hope this is a suitable introduction and a good place to start for you.
Thank you very much, Mrinalini, for the absolutely suitable but very long and detailed introduction, which I appreciated, and also for the invitation, both to you and to the British Council. It's a privilege to speak to you this evening about Waves Across the South, which of course was published a few months ago and in paperback very recently. In fact, this week, it's being published in the UK.
Congratulations. And I think it's available in Sri Lanka at Pereira Hussein, isn't it? And Pereira Hussein.
Yes.
And thank you for this wonderful work. Reading it was like being on a treasure hunt for me. I have no history background, and you inspired me to read and research, and so many aspects of cultures and peoples and times that I had never even heard of. Your desire to share your knowledge and discoveries. I wish, our social studies teachers had taught us this way. I would have paid better attention. So I would like to begin, please, by asking you to introduce this age of revolutions, to place it in context for those of us who are unfamiliar with this time in history, because this will help our non-historian audiences to better appreciate what you're going to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to do that. So the Age of Revolutions is a set of decades at the end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century. And for historians, this set of decades at the end of the 18th century and the start of the 19th century are seen really to have given rise to our modern world, the world which we still inhabit. And in some ways, we're perhaps at the end of that arc that began with the Age of Revolutions. So if we want to think about events that constitute the Age of Revolutions, usually the events that historians utilize here are in the Atlantic Ocean. So there is, of course, the American Revolution, 1765 to 1783, the French Revolution, 1789, the Industrial Revolution as well, can count in this age of revolutions, or the Haitian Revolution, which is very significant for Black politics. And then soon a whole series of independence movements in Latin America in the early 19th century, which give rise to new nation states. So if those are the events, and if the thesis is that it gave rise to the modern world, the reason for that is because these events are seen to have given rise to, say, or consolidated even, the idea of the nation state. And of course, we live still in a world of nation states. It also is, or this period is seen to have consolidated notions of rights and citizenship. It's seen to have consolidated modern forms of warfare and militarism. It's seen to have given rise through huge amounts of data collecting to the science that we have still in our world today, and even to notions of reason. So really, a modernity, if we want to call it that, or the modern world in which we inhabit and which we know well, where we take a lot of things for granted about nation states, about politics, about ideas, really comes via the age of revolutions. Now, of course, this is an Atlantic story. And so what I wanted to do in Waves Across the South was, in fact, to take that well-known story of the age of revolutions to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, because it really troubled me that it hadn't been taken to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean really in a sustained fashion. And that the implication then was really that the world that we inhabit in some ways began in the Atlantic. And I found this to be problematic, partly because of being Sri Lankan, but partly because also I researched this part of the world. So that really was the beginning of this research project, which gave rise to this book.
Thank you. I'm sure there's a lot that people can pick up from there also if they're interested and take it forward. I think you would like to share a presentation now and sort of take us through
Absolutely.
some of what you have included in the book. Yes, okay. All yours.
Yes. Absolutely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through some slides. And so I'm going to screen share, and hopefully this is going to work smoothly. Let us see. So what I thought I would do is that I would talk to you about the Pacific side of the book, partly because it perhaps would be an area that is less known to a Sri Lankan audience as well. But before I do that, I thought what I would do is that, here's the cover of the book, which I think we may speak about later, is that I would very quickly summarize the argument of the book for you. And as Mrinalini quite rightly said, the idea of the wave is a significant aspect of the book. It's there in the title, Waves Across the South. And here is an image of a wave crashing into the shoreline of Chennai in South India, of course, Madras in the period. And as you can see, there are these European men who are coming off a ship which is behind on the horizon, and they're being rowed very sort of vigorously by, of course, South Indians, people of color who are doing all the work, whilst these Europeans are sitting on that small boat, taking them to the shore. And so it really is an indicator of the character of this period at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, where maritime travel was very significant. And really, lots of things can go wrong. You can imagine the kinds of things that could go wrong in this image, looking at it, because it's a rough ocean, it's a huge surf. People can be washed aboard, ships can be wrecked in this period, storms can strike. There's a lot of work that's necessary to make these sorts of connections possible, to make globalization possible. Globalization isn't seamless or easy. It actually requires all of this labor. And it is quite precarious in the way it operates. Things can go wrong. Now, as I say that, I wanted to kind of use the object of the wave, which of course is an environmental object, and there's a lot of environmental history in this book, to summarize really the whole argument about the age of revolutions. And so as you look at this unpredictable and violent wave crashing on the shore of India, let me just try and summarize the argument for you. Firstly, there is an indigenous wave of creativity, of unrest, of revolt, of association in the late 18th and the early 19th century. But that then meets, and in some ways is followed by, what is almost like a tsunami, which is an imperial wave, which is responsive to the indigenous wave, and which overtakes it at times as well in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So really, if one wants to define the age of revolutions in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, it's about these two waves, the indigenous wave of creativity, unrest, revolt, and association, and the imperial wave, which is responsive to that earlier one, and which actually constitutes what I call in the book a counter-revolution. Now, leaving the abstract argument to one side, what I want to do now is just to tell you a story as a way of just giving you an example of what this looks like in practice, and to take you to a place which is far away, which is here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, and it's the Tongan archipelago. And the story that I'm going to tell you is about a 15-year-old English man called William Mariner, 15 years old, mind you. But it's actually not a story about William Mariner in many ways. It's a story about Tongans in the Pacific in this transformative era of the age of revolutions. So in 1806, in Tonga, an Englishman called William Mariner was taken captive, as I say, at the age of 15. Mariner had arrived in Tonga on an English private ship, the Port-au-Prince. This ship had been formerly French, but now it was English, and it was being used to raid French and Spanish vessels. So in some ways, I guess it would be correct to say, or to see the people on this ship as pirates, as in the Europeans being pirates. And in fact, historians in Tonga today have described this expedition, which came in 1806, as one of piracy and robbery. The ship was also targeting the whales that roamed across the Pacific, and whaling was a significant industry in this period of time. There was a lot of whale oil on the ship, and that's significant now to what will unfold shortly. So what occurs when the ship comes in is that it's taken over by about 300 islanders. They go aboard and surprise the crew. They surprise the so-called pirates and robbers. And this was despite the fact that a warning had been issued by some Hawaiians who were on board the Port-au-Prince. They understood Tongan, that there was a conspiracy afoot to take over this vessel. The ship was grounded by the people who took it over in Tonga. The guns were stripped. The iron was stripped, and it was then looted and burnt. About half of the crew were killed by the Tongans. Now, a critical source for this episode, and here is an image of William Mariner in the costume of the Tonga Islands, 1816, and he published a book. And this book, actually, written by Mariner with the help of an editor, is a critical source for what happened and what followed. And here he describes what unfolded after the ship was grounded like this and stripped of what was on it. In the evening, they set fire to her in order to get more easily afterwards at the ironwork. All the great guns were loaded, and as they began to be heated by the general conflagration, they went off one after another, producing a terrible panic, which in some ways is a racialized view of thinking about indigenous peoples, a terrible panic among all the natives. So when Mariner was found spending a great deal of time reading and writing, his books and papers were confiscated and burnt by order in the belief that they were connected with witchcraft. In addition to guns and other materials which were taken off this ship, Tongans took people captive as well. And of course, as I said earlier, Mariner was taken captive. He was very much liked by the chief, Finau Ulukalala II, who raided the ship as well, that he was adopted by one of the chief's wives. Another of the survivors of this wreck of the Port-au-Prince was serving as prime minister, quote unquote, to a chief on Vavau. And you can see Vavau up here. Further to the north, as late as 1830, this man was prime minister in the Vavau group. So from the Hapai group, Ulukalala, the chief who adopted Mariner, wished to attack the political center of these islands to the south in Tongatapu. And so in seizing stuff off the Port-au-Prince, he was arming himself for his wars with the powers that be in Tongatapu. Mariner, together with 15 other Britons, participated in the raid that followed to the south, to Tongatapu. And what's really, really interesting to note here is that it was undertaken with the use of a fleet of canoes and the carronades, the guns, looted from the Port-au-Prince. In the end, one of the most important forts at Nuku'alofa, now the capital of Tonga, fell into their hands, and British muskets were used in this war. These people who were attacked were really awestruck by these weapons that were used by their assailants, describing balls entering houses, going around their dwellings, looking for someone to kill. It was almost like these weapons were alive in the description of the indigenous peoples who had to face them. So when at peace, this chief took up the opportunity for conversation with Mariner to learn about the outside world. And one topic that was particularly interesting was that of politics. He wished to be the King of England. Now, this is an image earlier on from Captain Cook's voyages, but what we're getting here then is really a notion of kingship being discussed between Mariner and the indigenous elites in Tonga in this period. And the first extract on the slide, which is from Mariner's book, bears this out. "Oh, that the gods would make me King of England. There is not an island," this is in the words of the chief, "however small, but that I would then subject to my power," etc. So Mariner finally escaped in 1810. When he left, it was really a painful parting because he had really integrated himself into Tongan ways. In 1832, Mafi Hape, who is Mariner's adopted mother in Tonga, sent him an intriguing letter. In her letter, written or probably transcribed for her as someone very familiar with Tongan, she notes that everyone has become a Christian by this time. Now, this is 1832, so sometime after the Mariner episode. She asks Mariner to send a ship. Here's the second quote from Mafi Hape's letter, translated by Nigel Statham. "If you have genuine affection for me, it would be wonderful if you could send your younger brother, if you have one, or your son, if you have one, so I can see him, and also," and now you can see the impact of Christianity here, "that you be shown in the Lord to be manly. If you are so determined not to come yourself and see me, he can come and live here instead." So obviously Mafi Hape, who is the adoptive mother of, or is supposedly the adoptive mother of Mariner, had converted by this time, and many people had converted. And what we see from this source is that it's also kind of a letter. So we have paper, we have writing, and new conceptions of behavior and manliness even being described in this source. But even as one could interpret the source like this, one still can use it to show that older ideas of chieftaincy are still operating here as well. How so? Obviously, Mafi Hape wanted to adopt this idea of chieftaincy, where chiefs adopted powerful sons to circumvent her lowly condition. By this point in time, she was in a very lowly situation, and she actually wanted Mariner then, in a sense, to send his son or his younger brother in order then to better her condition in 1832. Sadly, Mariner could not read Mafi Hape's letter when it arrived in London. He had forgotten most of his Tongan. He complained that the orthography of his mother's letter was in too unfamiliar a form, and that perhaps indicates that the English missionaries had actually changed the language quite significantly. After returning to England, Mariner took up gave up his life of adventure and became a stockbroker in London, married and fathered 11 children, and rather unfittingly, given his maritime adventures, very unfittingly, sadly drowned in Surrey Canal at the age of 53. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, there is a line which still carries the name Mariner from Mariner's son, George, who settled in Samoa. And it was very interesting whilst I was visiting Tonga, and here you see the memorial to the Port-au-Prince in Hapai. One of the stories I heard is that actually that Mariner had committed suicide in London. This is a sort of oral history in Tonga because he couldn't really come to terms with his new life in England. Furthermore, that actually Mafihape was his concubine rather than his adopted mother. So that's a story really from the book. It's one of many, many stories which are in the book. But let me just sort of build from the story towards that argument which I presented in abstract form a few minutes ago about those waves in conflict which constitute the age of revolutions. So what do we have here? We have the raiding of a vessel, the Port-au-Prince, the arrival of European invaders and looters, it should be said firstly, because it's too easy to think of the Tongans as the people doing the looting here first and foremost. But then the Tongans in turn also taking from Europe, and in the end actually reigning supreme over Europe. In taking skills, they take skills for war, they take materials for war, such as guns, and even people are taken captive by these Pacific Islanders, and they serve as advisors for war, William Mariner and others. So the Age of Revolutions is an age of global warfare between Europeans, and new political forms come to light and come to birth in this area. But that's also happening in the faraway Pacific. Wars are feeding other wars. As these weapons, European weapons, come into this area, they generate other wars in the Pacific as well. And what happens in Tonga is that we go into a period of war with the arrival of a range of European settlers in the 1790s, including evangelical missionaries, as well as those who've escaped from the convict settlement in Australia, and traders as well. And in the midst of this long civil war between rival chiefs, the investiture of the paramount chief, Tuitonga, is set aside. Instead of this notion of chieftaincy, or in replacement to it, comes a kind of more consolidated notion of monarchy. This is very interesting. By the way, these are the carronades, which you can still see at the site of the former British Embassy, which is interesting. So the objects from the Port-au-Prince are still circulating in Tonga to this date. But the point I'm making here really is about this man who is baptized in 1831 by the missionaries. So still in the period that I've been talking about as the Age of Revolutions. He has a very long life and is photographed here in his 80s, in the 1880s in Tonga. And he boasts, for instance, and this is a quote from English sources, British missionary sources, I think, I am the only chief on the island. When I turn, they will all turn. But in proclaiming himself as George I of Tonga, he consolidates a notion of monarchy and a centralized state in the Pacific. And that seems one of the contradictory results of this story. You can think about the Age of Revolutions as a period when monarchies are toppling, but here in the Pacific, what we're getting is the inauguration of a monarchy. And there are similar stories elsewhere in the Pacific as well. Meanwhile, this age of revolutions in the Pacific, which, you see all of these wars, you see a political change in the Pacific, this age of revolutions is really forgotten about and suppressed even elsewhere. And that maybe actually was one of the results, or is related to Romanticism. So in place of the Pacific as Pacific being a place where people are active and are agents with political ideas, what we get is a very romanticized view of the Pacific in stories, in various texts in Europe in this era. In fact, when published, Mariner's account was one source of inspiration for the poet Byron's idyllic description of South Pacific island culture. The Island was written in 1823. In Byron's telling, republicanism is rife in the island of Tubonia, the fictional island where the poem is set. It is, quote, an equal land without a lord. Here nature is bountiful and the islanders are relatively uncorrupted by sin. Labor is unnecessary because of what nature provides. Quote, where all partake the earth without dispute, and bread itself is gathered as a fruit. Meaning that actually it's almost like the diametric opposite of what was actually going on in the Pacific. In the Pacific, there were these wars, there were these conflicts, there were new political forms emerging, there was a great deal of political activity. But in these European texts, which were inspired by the Pacific, it's this romantic place where everything is peaceful and everyone is equal. So that, in a sense, is really quite telling for me, because for me, what I want to do is to kind of actually peel back some of the caricature and some of the racism even that the Age of Revolution story sort of involves in usual times, and to get to these indigenous perspectives, which are so important if we are to understand the possibilities that were open in the period and that carry on being open to indigenous peoples in the global South. So I think I'm going to end there. That's the end of my presentation, and I will hand back to Mrinalini for some questions.
Thank you, Sujit. I've been taking notes, so I might ask some sort of slightly wobbling questions.
That's
also.
Good.
I'm warning you. Okay. Since you started with Tonga, and I must tell people that Tonga is just one tiny little part of this book. There's so many other countries and stories in it, and so many histories. But thank you for sharing that particular story of Tonga in this age of revolutions. I was wondering if you could tell us something about what ramifications of the Tongan experience were left in Ceylon during that time, or were felt
Yeah,
here.
no, that's a really good question. So I have been working on islands quite a lot, Mrinalini. So partly because of growing up in Sri Lanka as well, I have been quite conscious of how islands have been rather marginalized in historical books and historical literature as well. So for that reason, there's a slight echo on my voice. I hope that's okay. So for that reason, I wanted to kind of actually put together a whole series of islands across the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So the relationship between Tonga and Sri Lanka is that, of course, all island cultures could be romanticized by Europeans in this era, right? So if Tonga was this peaceable place where everyone was equal, it was also the case that Sri Lanka could be cast like that, as a sort of Edenic landscape, where there was more gender equality than in India, for instance, or where caste was not as significant as in India, and so on. So that kind of colonial rhetoric was actually shared between Sri Lanka and the Pacific world. And in the colonial sources that I've used in the early 19th century, for instance, of Sri Lanka, there are striking similar, there are kind of parallels or even kind of comparisons between the Pacific and Sri Lanka, where people would say, it's a bit like, Captain Cook's, what Captain Cook says. Same thing is true in Sri Lanka as well. So in that way, there's a link between the two. Now, the difference, of course, is that here we have the Kingdom of Kandy. And so we had a monarchic line. And arguably what happens in the Age of Revolutions here is the finishing off of that monarchic line by Europeans, because Kandy falls and the last king is sent to India, and that's it for the monarchic line. So in some ways it is related to what's going on in the Pacific, but it's almost like a mirror image in some ways, right, is what I'm saying here, where you're getting the inauguration and the consolidation of monarchy in the Pacific. You're actually getting its forcible closure by Europeans. But having said that, you can't totally finish off a monarchic line. The memory of monarchy kind of reverberates, and through the perpetual revolts that one sees after the fall of Kandy, you have to search for a pretender, right, to kind of have a rebellion in the highlands, for instance, in the second quarter of the 19th century in Sri Lanka. So it would be too simplistic to say that the monarchic line just finishes. I think the memory of it and the reverberations from that monarchic line arguably still carry on to this day in the politics of Sri Lanka, making a big leap there. So it's related in various ways in terms of colonial tactics and rhetorics and representations. There are differences, and there are ways in which it's a mirror image. But in this book, I'm not trying to say that every island is the same. What I'm trying to say is that they're all distinctive, but that they're all shaped in some ways by the Age of Revolution story as well, partly because this is a period where maritime Europeans were exploring and colonizing like this.
Okay. now the problem is you've taken my brain in about 10 different directions. So I'm going to try and rein it in. One thing I want to ask you is just to sort of space the three thoughts out. One is about the images. I wanted to ask you, you use images in your book to sort of help the narrative and also to illustrate the point you're making. And you quoted Byron as well, and how he has romanticized, Tonga, or the experience of Tonga. How accurate? I mean, how reliable are images and these descriptions to a historian who is looking to excavate the history of these places?
Yeah. So I'm very interested in images, and you probably have quite rightly identified that from the book. And so one initial answer is to say that, of course, colonial texts are not reliable, right? A lot of these European texts come with their own biases and imaginings and European myths as well. So we shouldn't imagine that texts are more reliable than images. Having said that, images are also constructed for various purposes for their viewers. And some of the European images of the Pacific, for instance, are drawn not in the Pacific itself, but in fact in Europe on the basis of sketches undertaken on site. So in the book, what I kind of tried to do was to follow this philosophy, which I've now developed over some years, of weaving together a whole variety of sources, meaning images, texts, but also objects, by the way. And so the view I took is the more sources and more genre, if one had several genres of sources, then the likelihood is that actually you kind of, in a sense, compensate for the biases of a particular kind of source. So really not just images, but images plus text plus objects is what I'm saying here. Having said that, actually, I think the thing about images is that you can get to things which the texts don't give you. For instance, some of the images of Maori life and custom in the book are really, really useful because you can see, despite the fact that it's very colonial, you can see a meeting to discuss war, or you can see really the lay of the land in a bay, and so you can kind of work out what a place looks like, and also what a particular ritual or ceremony looks like as well. So those kinds of things are much harder to get from the dry colonial archive.
Okay, I'm going to hold on to my question on monarchies and take you to move. I want to move the conversation a little more into Sri Lanka before we move on. Moving into Sri Lanka and the relationship to water, which I certainly hadn't previously been sensitive to in the way you talk about it. In the chapter entitled "At India's Frontier, Waterborne Lineages of War," and addressing the conquest of the Kandyan Kingdom by the British, you state I'm quoting the page 225 in case you want to take a look. The British desire for Ceylon was a maritime one. An island so close to their increasing Indian territory with a large natural harbour in Trincomalee on the eastern coast was too good to give up to the enemy. If maritime concerns dictated in part Britain's imperial policy in Sri Lanka, Kandy was not without an oceanic imagination, for Kandy saw itself as owning the whole island. The kings of Kandy had prided their right of access to the ports on the coast, a key part of the diplomatic game which characterized Dutch-Kandian relations. And you also make a reference to this motif of water again in the Ingrisi Hatana, which is the record of that time. So I'm really curious because I had never thought of the Kandyan Kingdom thinking of, the water and the ports. I'd really like if you could talk a little bit more about that part of the book.
Absolutely. And actually, this goes back to my previous book, which is Islanded. So that para summarizes quite a lot of things that I argued for in Islanded. So that would be the reference rather than waves in some ways. But no, I mean, I think something we forget is, of course, that Sri Lanka is in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's a jumping off point if you're going from east to west or from west to east. And in a maritime world, it's a really significant jumping off point. So for preachers, for merchants, for rulers, it's a stopping off point. And one can think about religions like Islam, one can think about trading systems, pearl fishers, a whole series of different things where actually Sri Lanka is really, really vital. And we forget that because we very easily think about a lineage of kings in Sri Lanka as constituting our history. And so it's King 1, King 2, King 3, King 4. But we don't think about it in relation to all of these things going around the whole of the Indian Ocean. Now, to pick up the point about Kandy, I remember it being taught at school, I think, even. And, one thinks about this map and we think, it's in the hills. Yeah. And then the Europeans are on the coast. And it's landlocked. It's gonna fall apart at some point because the Europeans have circled it and they're like throttling it bit by bit, right? And it's gonna fall apart. And so, but that is not exactly the correct way of thinking about it, because Kandy sustained connections to the Indian Ocean world with Muslim and Tamil traders, Buddhist monks going to Burma and Siam. It had a sense of itself as really lord of the whole island, and also had a sense of various ports as historic ports which it owned. So if we think about it in terms of this map of the highlands and then the ring of the Europeans around, that's a European sense of cartography and a European political map. It's not how Kandy conceives of the political world it inhabits. It actually inhabits a world which is expansive and which stretches out to the Indian Ocean. And so we need a very different kind of idea of a very different notion of political imagination in relation to cartography to understand what Kandy thinks of itself. And so, the water is significant and the ocean is significant, and ideas of water turn up in Dingrisi Hatna, which is a war poem, which arises out of war with the British in 1803 with Dingrisi Hatna.
Yeah, that sort of struck me, so I thought maybe it'll be of interest to others as well. And if I get this right, going back to the whole monarchy and the chieftain, so the Pacific island nations had more of like a chieftain. They had several chieftains, that kind of setup, and India and Sri Lanka, we kind of had monarchies. I suppose Burma had a monarchy as well, and Thailand. So that was the setup. Is it that the Europeans encountered?
So I think, to go back to the Tongan story, what I'm saying partly is that the Europeans come along. I'm simplifying the story a lot by describing it like this. But it's a helpful way of thinking about it. I suppose the Europeans come along and say, who's your king? Who's your representative? And they themselves are debating monarchy at the time because it's the age of revolutions, and they're debating republicanism versus monarchy, by the way. So they're obsessed with who the king is in this specific island over here. And then the Pacific Islanders have a sense of hereditary chieftaincy, and they in turn are inaugurating monarchy as a way of enhancing and pushing forward their politics, given then the Europeans' constant query about monarchy in conversation with them. And so that's partly what I'm arguing for here, and that is tied up not just with ideas, but also with weapons and other sorts of material objects too. Now, as for the broader question, yes, in our part of the world, there is a sense of monarchy, but it's a different sense of monarchy to the European one. And this ties up really with what I was saying earlier about Kandy, I suppose, because, people talk about galactic polities, meaning that, it's like the king and the king's body, all these things, it's almost like a kind of solar system. Things are radiating around the king, but there's no kind of endpoint to the sort of field of gravity around the king, right? So basically what I'm saying is that in Europe, we have a much more rigid notion of monarchy with rigid political boundaries and so forth. So it's actually quite different to this idea of monarchy in South Asia in this period. But what's happening is that then in Asia, like in Japan, for instance, the monarchic system is remodeled on a European model in the 19th century as well. So increasingly, with the spread of Europe globally, monarchs globally are having to conform to the European model as well. So in a sense, it's different, but it's actually becoming more, in Asia, it's becoming more like Europe as time passes.
Yeah, because in our neck of the woods, it was polygamous. There was polygamous marriage also, right? There was the chief queen, and then there were sort of
Yes, there's a gender
Yeah.
dimension to it as well, which we can get onto as well.
Yeah. Yes, please. You talking about the title of your book and also the motif that you have used in the novel. You didn't. I would really like you to talk, if you don't mind at this point, just to sort of give it a little space. I'm holding up the book. I want you to talk about why you chose the image of the image on the cover and what it means.
There's a whole story behind that. I don't know how much of it I should tell, because it's partly about my interactions with my press. So yeah, this is a hardcover actually. And so basically, I'm gonna have to kind of hold it up just because people will need to look at it. So there are these shells and there are these sticks right through it. And so what I wanted to do was to have an indigenous image on the front. And this is not an indigenous image, but it's inspired by the charts which were used by indigenous islanders in the Pacific to navigate across the Pacific. So the point being that, in islands, we think, islands are isolated, they're small places. Why do they matter in world history? This is, some of the responses that some colleagues might make, or other historians might make to this kind of work. Why islands? Why let's think about India. Let's think about China. So really to kind of make the point that these islanders have kind of navigated across these vast expanses and basically undertaken huge projects of cultural exchange and settlement and trade even. And they have had navigational knowledge and cartographic knowledge as well, as is evident in these maps. And so we need to keep that in mind, because we too easily marginalize and belittle islanders. And so this is really a kind of statement of the importance of island culture and the centrality of islanders who've navigated across the sea in the making of our world.
Okay, so to every island of the sea and its motion has been an integral part of its being. And to quote you, to think with waves is to think with the push and pull dynamic of globalization. So my impression from the book was that many Pacific Islanders really embraced the pull of globalization during the Age of Revolutions. There was the Maori chief Teara, who had traveled to London. But have you seen a pushback against globalization in the world today in these island nations? Have they resisted this?
Yeah, to be clear, this is not a book that's glorifying globalization. It's a book that's critical of globalization. And that's partly why the violence of the waves, the unevenness of the waves, the disruption of the waves is quite useful for me to highlight through that motif of the wave. And in the Pacific, yes, it's right that islanders are taking on board things that come across the beach, people, ideas, weapons, as I illustrated earlier from Tonga. But there is also kind of a great deal of violence and resistance against invasion. Think about how that ship is taken apart. So it's a kind of critical response to globalization rather than an open-armed, yes, everything's fine sort of response to globalization. Now, in terms of resistance to globalization, yeah, certainly. I mean, basically nationalism is a classic kind of way in which one can have an anti-global kind of response, and that can be quite common in an island society. Because you can turn to purity, an emphasis on purity of various kinds. That can be anti-colonial, or that can be pro a certain outside power or whatever. So it can take very many manifestations. But I suppose globalization occurs in practice, even if it is contested as well over and over again.
Okay. And you chose the story of Mariner to sort of, for your presentation and to sort of introduce this to us. How did you choose whose voices should be heard and whose stories should be told when you were researching in the archives and when you were collating material?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I've got a very good answer to that, because it's a bit accidental. It's kind of who turns up and who grabs your attention, right? So I didn't kind of go, oh, right, this is my cast of figures, and maybe I should have done, because it may have all, it might have been more links right through the book. But But what happened was it was just a kind of bit of an exploration. So I really believed in going to the places, and so you would have seen the photographs from Tonga. But I decided, and this is pre-pandemic, and it was also before there was a sort of very firm idea of the climate emergency, I guess. I decided that I did have to I wanted to go to the main places that I was writing about. Partly because ethically I felt like I couldn't really write about these places without going to them. So yes, I went to Mauritius, I went to Burma, Myanmar, I went, etc., and to Tonga, etc., etc. And so when I got there, I spoke to people, and local scholars, brilliant historians in each of these sites, were really, really helpful. I went to the archive, and I saw what turned up. I also just actually visited, just walked some of the sites, looked at monuments, memorials, and things like that as well. And that too was really, really useful. So I kind of, in terms of research method, and your question is about research method, I sort of wanted to kind of immerse myself in the place, with the people, in the archive, and then see what turned up. So it was actually quite accidental who was foregrounded. Having said that, however, once it was William Mariner, or once it was whoever it might be, I very quickly kind of was self-critical, and I thought, well, actually, no, it's not about William Mariner, it's about Mafi Hape, because I thought it's really actually about that woman Mafi Hape as well. And so I tried to, in fact, very self-critically decenter the obvious people over and over again in my writing, because I thought that is really the way to kind of create a book that has greater reach in terms of the society one is writing about. And so to constantly move beyond the iconic figure, move beyond the man, move beyond the individual, even to a kind of broader group of people, to move beyond the capital or the big city to the frontier, and so forth. So to constantly decenter in order to get as rich a cast of figures and places as possible.
Yeah, because you said in an interview, in your conversation with Sunil Amrit, you said something about bringing out of the shadows characters that have been written out of history. And you really have, I think, your cast of characters is a very wide-ranging one. Can I take you now to the role of women? And because we are quite keen on the whole gender thing at British Council as well, so I'd like to have that part of the conversation as well. And you had talked about the sea wolves and Terrareno Nore.
Yeah.
I don't know how you say the name, but if you could talk a bit about that, because that was very fascinating, and then we could talk about gender.
Yeah, so this is actually a good instance of the point I was just talking about earlier, because so that chapter, which is on the Tasman Sea, has material on Sydney, and it has material on iconic Aboriginal Australians like Bungaree and Cora. But what I thought was, actually, no, I'm not going to leave it with those well-known individuals. What I'd like to do is to actually kind of move beyond that. And so that's when Tasmania comes in rather than Sydney. So I'm moving, across the sea to the frontier. And in Tasmania, I thought, let's, what can I do which, gets to a different aspect of the story? And I came across the story of sealing and whaling. I worked in the archives in Hobart, and it was absolutely fascinating, actually, to be in Hobart, because one felt really at the end of the earth in some ways. And there were these sorts of ethnographic kind of reports, really, by a man called Kelly, for instance, who's into whaling, of these communities. I mean, there has been work done on this by others, by the way, which I cite in the book as well. But what I was interested in is these sealing camps on the north shore of Tasmania, where one gets then escaped convicts, where one gets all kinds of Europeans and Americans and castaways of various kinds who are men. And they are living then with, in sometimes very violent circumstances, and there's a lot of reporting, which is in the book, there's some extracts on this, of violence by the men towards these Aboriginal women, who are Tasmanian Aboriginal women. So this is the story, right? So it's a frontier of emerging Australia, but also a frontier from Hobart to the south. Hobart is to the south. And these Aboriginal women are the people who have the knowledge to seal. So they are, helping the men to kill the seals and actually swimming with the bodies of the dead seals as well. So to get to your point about gender, this is a completely different gender order, right? Certainly there's a great deal of violence, and that's undeniable, but it's the women who have the skills. And so this whole idea of the woman as the help, it's not the woman as the helper, right? So, and then into that story of the women sealing and more broadly having knowledge of fishing comes the European naval explorer. I'm a man, I can explore, I'm the only person who can explore, right? So it's totally different gender order. No women on the ships, unless they're kind of, dressed as men on these European ships. Totally male space. So, and then comes the Christian marriage, because a lot of these women are then taken into protection by Europeans. And of course, it's a genocide, as we know, in Tasmania. The numbers fall off very, very quickly. It's one of, the horrific crimes of the British Empire. And so that kind of story just vanishes so quickly. It's a sort of flicker, the sort of sealing camp and the different gender order, as it sort of mutates into settlement, family relations of, the woman as helper. So, yeah.
It was like such a fleeting story, but I did want you to recount it because, and in these island communities, I mean, I don't know what the female word for chieftain is, but did you have women also in positions of leadership in these island communities in the Pacific Islands?
Well, I mean, certainly by the 1840s and so on, you get queens, like the Queen of Tahiti or the Queen of Hawaii and so forth later. So there are, there are women who are sort of seen as monarchs by Europeans, and certainly in Madagascar, by the way, which I know you're interested in. This is the case. There's a queen in Madagascar as well, isn't there, Rinaldi? Yeah, I mean, in answer to the question, there are different kind of gender aspects to kind of ideas of succession and so forth. And I laid those out in relation to Tonga, for instance, in the book. And of course, then when you get these big kings who are men, it can be about masculine performance as well, and authority too. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that, yes, the gender order is different in relation to chieftaincy, though one can't generalize. It's very sort of place specific. But it also kind of mutates into a kind of notion of kind of marriage and so forth and morality as we go through the 19th century. And now I kind of remember that certainly in Tahiti there is work, there's scholarship that bears this out in relation to the Queen of Tahiti and how she needs to kind of conform to notions of femininity that are European in order to get her.
So the whole weaker sex thing came with the European sort of wave.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't mean that there's no patriarchy before the Europeans. Of course, there is patriarchy before Europeans, but this idea of the helpmate, the woman who's the married partner, etc., is certainly a kind of the culture of settlement imperialism.
Okay, that's interesting. And I'm not so sure whether I want to revisit the whole Madagascar story I was talking to about ancestor worship and all of that. But how do the Pacific Island nations continue to retain that? Because they have that relationship with their ancestors. And you had used this beautiful phrase, to walk backward into the future while facing the past. So do these nations still retain those traditions and rituals, of that relationship with their ancestors?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a question really for a Pacific Islander in some ways. And I was very much conscious of the fact that I'm a foreigner writing about ancestors, and that ancestors are sacred and revered in various ways by Pacific peoples. Yeah, I mean, I was in a couple of ceremonies and so on where it was really, really moving to see how they respond to historical objects. And also how genealogy is really significant, meaning the recitation of ancestry over generations. So that phrase which you quoted me having said of walking into the future is really a sort of an understanding of ancestors as being present, right? And time as not being linear. It's sort of cyclical almost, right? And so that's so interesting to think about if you're a historian, because historians are always, going, 1845, 1815. It's a kind of linear sense of time, but actually the way history and memory works in the Pacific is actually different and challenges this idea of history that we often use.
Okay. You also had, in the run-up to the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference of the Parties, COP26, which the United Kingdom will host in Glasgow in November this year, we have been hosting a series of online programs to raise awareness and engage conversation around climate change. I have heard you made references to climate and the future possible ramifications of not only the age of revolutions, but its aftermath on climate. I'd like you, if you don't mind, Sujit, to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so actually the section of the book which is closest to that question is on the Bay of Bengal, and it's the section of the book that works out of Madras Observatory. And so what's going on in the Age of Revolutions, I argue, is the gathering of huge amounts of data, right, at one level. And that data can be about the tides, it can be about stars, it can be about the weather, it can be about the body, it can be about, a whole series of different variables and things. And this is a very kind of empiricist kind of moment, because people are kind of paranoid about military concerns as well. And so they just go collecting data. And that's what one sees in Madras Observatory, which I interpret as part of a kind of Age of Revolutions sort of institutional history. So as all of the data collecting is going on, the result is that we think about the Earth as just an object that you can manipulate. Yep. So basically, you detach yourself from the Earth, and you have a model of weather. You have a model of, the curvature of the Earth. It's not, you have a model of the stars and so on and so forth. So just going back to what we were just speaking about a minute ago, Mirinali, with the Pacific Islanders and the way they inhabit this, lived past, where ancestors are present, where, relations with nature are much more complicated. That's totally different. It's the European model of, you detach yourself and you have big data and you crunch big data and then you intervene in nature. And the intervention in nature that figures in that chapter on the Bay of Bengal is then really the origins of colonial Singapore, of colonial settlements in Southeast Asia, because once you've modeled the weather, you've modeled the monsoon, you know where to build your ports if you're going from Madras to China, right? So you have a very kind of exploitative view of nature, which is emerging in the Age of Revolutions out of all this data crunching. And in some ways, we're now at the end of that story. This is as far as we can go. Where further? I mean, what next? If we carry on in this sort of mode of empiricist, utilitarian data collecting to intervene in nature, well, we're not going to find our way forward as a human race. So that really is one of the ways to answer your question. But another way to answer your question is actually, I've recently written a piece which is totally separate, Rinalini, on the pandemic, where I actually argued that the pandemic is also an environmental crisis, because it's about the changeable relations between humans and animals. Right? And so really that too can be charted from that early modern moment right to the present. And so it's not something, the pandemic isn't something that came out of the blue. It actually makes total sense if one thinks through how we are kind of venturing into new sort of wildlife. I mean, in a sense, if one thinks about China kind of expanding into forests, into new territory. That's one of the contexts for the emergence of this pandemic in relation to bats and so forth in China and pangolins. So what I did was to actually sort of track the story of pangolins here in Sri Lanka as well, and to show how it's a really fascinating animal and how we've had this very complicated relationship with pangolins and wildlife more generally. But now we're actually kind of this exponential killing. And so if you have that sort of exploitative relationship with wildlife and with nature, and we're going into every wildlife frontier, then you're going to have a pandemic.
Yeah. can I close that part of the whole book thing? And can I ask you, I want to talk a little bit about the little elephant in the room. You are Sri Lankan and you were born and educated here to begin with. And Cambridge is this dream destination for so many young people who want to go abroad to study. Sujit, can you talk a bit about your story and why you chose history as your area of specialization, and tell us something what it means to be professor of world history at Gonville and Caius College, please?
Yeah, no, that's a really that's a hard question to answer very briefly, but let me try.
You don't have to be brief. You don't have to be brief. Lots of people will be very interested.
You shouldn't say that. You'll be sorry if I kind of carry on at length. No, I think that basically I would never have imagined that I would be a historian, Mrinalini. In the sense that, of course, it's not something that anyone imagines in Sri Lanka, right? I mean, even now people say, what are you doing? What's the use of that, etc. If I tell them in Sri Lanka. And so I think, as your question, it happened a bit like what I was saying earlier about the way I do research. It was a bit of an accident. I just sort of enjoyed it. And I went into it more and more, and I carried on doing it more and more. And then, somebody gave me a job, and then I just carried on, and then I eventually became professor. So it was just a sort of series of adventures and things that happened, which just sort of unfolded like that, really. It wasn't sort of planned in any way. Now, if I were to make a sort of lesson of this, I think actually what I would say to young people is just sort of follow your interests, really. It's fine to follow your interests. And I know that there is a huge deal of pressure in Sri Lanka to get the best grades and to do the become a doctor or whatever it might be. But actually, it's fine to follow your interests. And as human beings, we need to follow our interests because that's what makes for a happier society and also more reconciled society, arguably. Because we need a variety of different kinds of knowledges and forms of expertise. Medicine is very important, I wouldn't say not in a pandemic. But there are other things as well, cultural, artistic, that are significant. And so just, follow the things you're interested in and see where they lead. And it's fine to do that. And I think it's actually in keeping with Sri Lankan culture to do that as well, because it's a place where there's a great deal, as I've suggested already, it's an island where a great deal has happened culturally, artistically, et cetera. So, it's part of our heritage to actually do all of this rather than simply want to be doctors or engineers. So that's one thing. In terms of being in Cambridge, it's complicated because, of course, it's a very wide place and so forth and so forth. So yeah, it's challenging, but it's kind of enjoyable in its own way. But it's nice to be here in Sri Lanka and to have this conversation with you in Sri Lanka and to feel linked up with Sri Lanka after 2 years away as a result of the pandemic as well.
I'm so grateful, and we are all so grateful from the British Council and from the library that you made this time, and you have been very patient with my questions, Sujit. So thank you so very much. And the book is part of the British Council Library's collection now, so we have it on our shelves. And we've only discussed, I think, a very, very, very tiny portion of this very thought-provoking book, Waves Across the South. And I hope this discussion will inspire our audiences and our readers to explore this book. So thank you so very much. And please go through the doors that Professor Sivasundaram opens for you and take a longer look, because there are so many little explored places that you have been to and you have written about. And it's wonderful. Thank you so much for shining a light on it's I can't tell you enough how much there is in this book to learn from, and how much it really actually, and you've included over 100 pages, I think, of reference and index. So it's really something for people who are genuinely interested and who want to, to sort of expand their knowledge and their awareness. So thank you very much, Sujit. It was such a pleasure to have you.
You're too kind, Mrinalini, and thanks for the enthusiasm and also for reading the book so carefully and for really the very interesting and relevant questions as well. Thank you. And it's been a pleasure.
I hope so.
Pleasure
Thank
to
you.
join
I hope the questions would be, I hope they did justice to what you have written. So
Yeah,
thank
no,
you.
you did it. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to watching us and listening to us. And thank you to Sajid for the support behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah, thanks for the support.
And thank you to Nirmali and Ramola for making also this possible and for the introductions. So good night, everyone, and keep reading and stay safe and stay well. Thank you, Sujit. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.